Hey guys, welcome back to another Kaczynski video. Today I'm going to be showing you three types of transitions ranging from easy, medium, to hard, and to which you can use for cool effects within your game. So let's get into it. So I've already set up the three buttons for the player to step on in order for them to trigger their respective difficulty of transition. Easy is green, yellow is medium, and red is hard. And as you can see here in replicated storage, I've also set up the remote events for its respective buttons, easy, medium, and hard, which will be explained later. And I've already set up the touched event script in server script service. So here I've defined my variables, and I've already set up the touched events for each button, easy, medium, and hard. So if you're not familiar with like the bounce and step and events, you should probably watch a video before you continue on with this tutorial. But just to recap, what I've said here is that if a player steps on this button, then the game will retrieve its character and get its player eventually, and it will fire a remote event to the player in order for it to trigger its respective transition. So the first transition we're going to be doing is the easy transition, which is the fade in and fade out. Now I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of games before, so now I'm going to show you how they do it. So first let's insert a screen GUI, insert a GUI, and change and tick this to yes and ignore GUI instead. You're going to thank me later. And let's insert a frame and local script. All right, so first let's adjust the properties of the frame, which is going to be our fade background. We're going to adjust the scale properties of the size instead of the offset so that it applies to all devices and it fills up the whole screen. Oof, sorry if that's too bright. Let's change the color to black. Yep. And now we're going to adjust the background transparency. So basically, how fade in and fade out works is that they adjust the background transparency by sliding it a little. So if you want to fade in, you decrease the background transparency little by little, like this. And likewise, if you want to fade out, you increase the background transparency. You slide it to the right, as you can see on my properties, like this. So how does this work in code? So let's type it up. Let's turn the visible to false so that it starts off with invisible. So let's define our frame, which we're gonna title it fade background. So local fade equals script.parent.fade background. Okay, good. So now we're gonna type the line where it receives the remote event from the server, the easy remote event. So game.replicated storage.easy client event, and we're gonna make this a function. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change the visible to true so that we can start tampering with the background transparency equals true. And now in order to change the background transparency at a constant rate, we're going to add a for loop. So for I equals 1, 0, negative 0.03, 2. Okay, so the 1 here is basically the starting background transparency, which is 1, as you've just seen. And we aim to get it down to 0 so that it's fully in place and you can see the black screen. So, and this is just the rate of change. So when it iterates, it changes by negative 0.03. So now we're going to change the background transparency, fade.background transparency equals I, and we're going to wait 0.01. And congratulations, you've just made a fade in script. It's simple as that. So if you want to fade out, basically just add wait 1 and for I equals 0. So now you got to change the values and you got to make the rate positive. Yeah. Basically copy that, and once you're done, basically you just got to make the visible to false. And you've done making a fade in and fade out. So the rate here, if the number is higher, for example 0.05 or 0.1, it will go at a faster rate. So it will fade in or fade out faster. But however, if it's a lower number, like this, for example, it will fade in slower. So now let's see our fade in come into action. So once we're playing, as you can see, we step on. Wow, it just fade in, and now we fade out. And that's pretty much it for fade in and fade out. So now let's move on to medium. So the next step is the medium transition, which is the iris effect. Now you've probably seen this in Meep City, or more famously, Bugs Bunny. Now I'm going to show you how to do it. So first step, you got to create an image with a hole in the middle. So I've done this on Adobe Illustrator, as you can see right here. You can use other apps just as long as you set the artboard to 1920 by 180 pixels. Or an alternative you can use is to download the decal, which I'm going to put on Roblox and down in the description. So all you got to do is just export this image as a transparent PNG and you're set to go. All right, so let's insert the image label into Screen GUI and let's essentially loading the image in. So now let's set this to full scale using the scale, adjusting the scale properties instead of the offset so that it applies to all devices. Okay, and now we can load in the image. So you can get the image from the link in the description on Roblox, like I said before, and you can copy paste that and put it in. I already got the image loaded in here, so let's just use that. Now let's adjust the background transparency to 1, so now you can see through the image. So basically, we also got to adjust the position to 0.5 so that it centers in the middle. So also adjusting the anchor point. All right, so basically how the iris effect works is that they keep zooming it down in the middle. So there's 0.6, let's just, for example, like that, and it gets smaller and smaller as we go. So yeah, so if we adjust these scale properties simultaneously, it gets smaller and smaller until you can't see it anymore. Like for example, 0.015 and 0.015. So like that, it gets smaller like that. So let's just revamp that. And so as you can see, if we decrease the size simultaneously, you can still see some of the game. And we don't want that. So let's add some frames around it so that it hides that at 4 frames. And I'll be back when I've adjusted all of them. All right, so now I've added all 4 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I even recolored them, and I've also renamed the image label to Iris. So now you can see some of these lines right here, which is not what we want. So let's just change the border size pixel of all of these assets to 0 right here, and it should get rid of most of them. However, there's some here. So feel free to overlap the lines with your frames. And I also did notice that all of these frames right here, their size are adjusted with the offset. All right, let me just, yeah, you can see here, they're adjusted with the offset. So I personally use a plugin to convert it to scale, but you can copy the units here. So scale position for each frame. So I'll leave the plugin in the description as well, but if you don't want to download it, you can just copy all of the coordinates right here, 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 and here. So, okay, great. Now that's done. Now we can just resize this to its target size that we want before it disappears. It's going to be a really small number, like that. And you want to readjust the size so that it also covers the screen at that. All right, so now once that's done, as you can see, the hole's like really small here. Now you can adjust the size to 5 so that we don't see all this black background. And 5. And we also want to add like a black background to hide everything, so that once all the tweening is done, like this is the animation what we're gonna do to adjust the iris is done, we can hide it all with this black background. So let me just quickly rename that, quickly size it up. I'll be back. All right, so now I've adjusted this properties full size using the scale properties and adjusted the color. Now we can get on with programming. So let's go into our local script and define our variables. So local iris equals script parent dot iris, and our black background is local bb equals script parent dot black background. All right, so now time to code the part where our game receives the medium remote event. Medium. And now, now let me just quickly make this invisible. And we also want to make the iris invisible at first. So now when the game receives the event, now we can say iris.visible equals true. So now we can start tampering with it. And we want to decrease its size instantaneously. So we can use the tween property. So iris tween size to a udim2.new, which is like a quantity of 4 coordinates, which is basically the size right here. So we want to adjust that to 0.0150, 0.0150 is earlier. It's like basically what I showed you earlier. And I would suggest you don't go lower than this to avoid issues with other devices. So now when that's done, we have to wait 1 second. So basically, because this tween size does not yield the script for it to wait, it automatically moves on to the next line. So we just have to wait 1 second. And after that, we can basically make the bb.visible equals true to hide the hole. And to tween back out, you just wait 1 second, just like delay time, and we can just tween it back to its normal position, 5, 0, and 5, 0, so that it hides the hole. And now, oops, wait 1 second, bb.visible equals false. And then now, once that's done, wait 1 second, you can iris.visible equals false. So this is these three arguments are completely optional. So these two, nil and nil, what I'm typing here is like the style of which you want the animation to go. I'll leave the link in the description for the different types of animations you can try out. And this is the time it takes for it to tween. So the default is 1, but you can change it. But as long as you change this 0.7, you're gonna have to change this to 0.7 as well. And likewise, if I do it right here, you're gonna have to change it for here. So you might want to have some sort of variable for that if you want to have if you want to change the time. So however, I think it should be done, so let's test it out. Let's zoom in. You can see right here, and it zooms out like that. Alright, so now we move on to the hard transition, which I actually don't have a particular name for this, but I call it the square buildup. Now you might have seen this in games like Pokemon Brick Bronze, so now I'm going to show you how they do it. So now let's insert a screen GUI, a frame that handles our whole transition. Let me just resize it right here for full screen. I'll be back. Alright, now once that's done, let's change the name of the frame to square buildup. And let's also adjust the transparency to 1 so that it's invisible. And now let's insert a frame within the big frame. So this frame right here is going to be our first row of the frame. We want to have rows of frames stacked together. So let's adjust the size of this to the X scale to 1 so that it fills up the entire screen in terms of width. And the height, it's going to be a number between 0.1 or 0.15. So I prefer to do it 0.15. I think it's going to look nicer that way. So now once that's done, let's insert a UI frame. Oh, sorry, not a UI frame, I meant a UI grid layout. So the idea here is that when we want to add UI frame blocks into rows that are stacked together. So we need to adjust the cell padding size to 0, 0 and 0, 0 so that when we add the UI frame blocks, they're going to connect with one another without having some margin in between them. So now once that's done, let's adjust the cell size as well. So the Y scale is going to be 1 so that it fills up the entire row in terms of height. And the cell size is going to be a number that when you continuously add it up, it's going to equate to a perfect one. So 0.1 will do, or 0.2 or 0.25 would do. I'm going to go with 0.1 because it's going to look nice that way. Let's adjust the transparency size to 1. Let's insert a frame here. So that's going to be our first block when we insert it. So when we keep duplicating it, right, it's going to fill up the row more and more and more so that the number, the 0.1, is going to allow us to fill up the entire row perfectly. Now, when we add this final block, it's going to move on to the next row if we were to have a different number that would not act up to a perfect one. All right, now once that's done, let's rename this frame to row 1 so that's easier for our code when we program the transition. And now let's also adjust the background transparency to 0 so that it's easier to see. And now let's keep duplicating this row until it fills up the entire screen. So let's rename this to row 2. And if it's a 3 decimal number, if the position is not perfect, then truncate it up to either 2 or 1 decimal place, depending on the number. So 1.9 turns into 0.15. And now let's keep repeating this process until it fills up the entire screen. So now row 3. And if it's 0.299, truncate it up to 0.3 and so on. So I'll be back. All right, now once that's done and you've renamed all your rows in order, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, for example, and now you can make them all invisible. So background transparency, let's adjust that. And now let's insert the frame that we want to clone onto the rows of frames that we already have. So let's insert a frame into this screen GUI, and we can leave it like this as long as we insert another frame within that frame. Because when we insert this parented frame onto a row, for example, you can only tween the child frame of the parent frame. So now let's adjust this size to 0, okay, 0, 0, 0, 0. And let's make this really small, so 0 0.1 and 0 0.1. So because when we program the transition, right, we want to make sure that it goes from a small size to a big size. And we also want to position it in the center of the parent frame. So adjust the position to 0 0.5 and 0 0.5. All right, I believe that's done. Let's make them both invisible. All right, so I actually need to adjust some properties first, my bad. Let's distinguish between the parent frame and the child frame. So let's call it frame clone, and let's rename the child frame tween. And let's also adjust the background transparency of the parent frame. So make it 1 so that when we clone it onto the rows, the parent's invisible. Actually, no, we've got to make this way smaller. Yeah, so now we can actually get onto programming. All right, so as you can see, I'm in the local script. I've also set up the remote event listener for the hard transition. So now let's also define our frame that handles all of our rows. So local SBU equals script.parent parent dot square buildup. And we also need to define some variables within the function. So we need to define the number of rows. So as you can see, we have 7 rows. The number varies depending on how you position your rows and so on. And we also need to define the number of columns that we have. So as you can recall, I had 10 columns, but the number varies depending on how you adjusted the X scale of your cell size. So I had 10 columns. And now we need to define the number of times we're going to repeat this process. So what I mean is that the idea is that we want to have a loop, right? And every time the loop iterates, we're going to have a certain number of blocks appear at once. So we need to define the number of times we need to repeat this. And the formula for that is basically rows plus columns minus 1. So for example, I have 7 rows, 7 plus 10, so 17, minus 1, 16. So we're going to repeat this process 16 times. And we also need to define the frame that we're going to clone into the rows. So local frame equals script.parent frame clone. And we also need to define the tween time, so how long it'll take to animate. I suggest it's going to be a really small number, so 0.05, but not too small. I suggest this number is going to be great. So now we need to add a for loop for I equals 1, and we're going to repeat this 16 times, do. So just a quick heads up, I'm not going to explain much of what's happening because the explanation is simply really hard and it requires another video for that. So stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to explain the whole code. So we also need to add another nested loop, so another for loop. So for k equals 1, repeat, no, sorry, not repeat amount, I do. So we need to add a conditional statement, so if not SBU. So if it doesn't find a particular row, and we concatenate this with k, then break the loop. So because the reason why we're adding this conditional statement is that k is eventually going to reach higher than 7. So 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. And we simply don't have row 8, 9, 10. We don't have facilities for that. So it's going to break the code. So we need to break out of the loop before it breaks the code. And so we can define the frame that we're going to, equals frame.clone. So this is basically the variable for our clone frame, and we need to parent it to equals SBU row k. So for example, if k equals 1, then it's going to parent it into row 1. 2, if it's k equals 2, then row 2, and so on. And we also need to make it visible, so we can actually see the frames. True. And I know we've already done this, but I just want to make sure that the parent frame has a background transparency of 1. And now we can need to define the actual frame, which is the child frame of the frame that we cloned in. Find first child, frame tween. And now we can tween the frame, so actual frame, tween size and position, udim2.new, 1010, And we also need to adjust the position. It's not new. Let's make this 0, 0, 0, 0, and nil, nil. And so basically these extra variables, these two are the style in which you want to tween it. Once again, I'll leave the links in the description for those. And the tween time, how long it'll take. So it takes 0.05 seconds to tween the block. And now we need to wait tween time so that it waits for the tween to finish so we can move on to the next set of blocks to be cloned. And I also need to adjust some variables. For example, the background color should be black, and border size pixel should be 0, so we don't see any outlines. I mean, the color doesn't matter, but black would do. So now we can actually test it out. Wow, okay, that was great. Now let's achieve the reverse effect. Alright, so this part is completely optional, but it saves more assets, therefore better performance-wise and less laggier for the player. So now we have to do is just add an if statement. So else if hashtag SVU row K get children equals calls +1, then continue. So basically, we're going to be filling up rows, right, with blocks and stuff, and eventually, at some point, our row will be filled up entirely. It's going to be full. So it's going to have 11 items, basically 10 blocks plus the UI grid layout. That's why I added a +1 there. And so if it happens to be full, then we're just going to continue on to the next row to fill up. In that way, it's going to save more assets. So now let's continue on with the reverse effect. I did a delay time with wait 1, and basically we're just going to have the same loop. So let's copy that. Let's delete everything in here. Yeah. Okay, so basically we might want to also have this statement right here. Copy that from the first loop. So basically we know that K is going to increase more than 7, and we simply don't have row 8. So we need to break out the loop before it breaks the code. So now we have to identify the frame that we want to delete. So frame to delete, and we need a way to classify each frame so we know which frame to delete. So we can do that by giving it a name. So new frame dot name equals frame hashtag SVU row K get children -1. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that once we've cloned the frame and parented it to the row, for example, if we're adding the first frame to the row, so basically once we've cloned and parented it to the row, there's going to be 2 items, right? So what I've done is I'm getting the number of items within that row, and I'm subtracting it by 1 because there's a UI grid layout in there. And if there's 2 items, subtract 1, that makes it frame 1. So now we actually have a way to identify the frame to delete. So now all we have to do is basically go to SVU row K, and we need to find a way. We need to find first child, frame, and there's this certain formula that identifies the way to delete a certain number of blocks in the same pattern that we want to show the number of blocks. Once again, I'll explain this in the next video, but all you have to do is just minus K plus 1. And yeah, that should be it. Now, we need to check if the frame actually exists, because if not, then it's going to be game breaking. So we need to continue if the frame does not exist. And now all we have to do is just identify the child frame, the frame that we actually want to tween and delete. So maybe just rename this so that we can avoid confusion. So adjust the name to frame to delete. And what we want to do is adjust the position and size back to its original properties before we clone it onto the rows. So 0.01 and 0.1. So that's the initial size. That's the size we're going to tween to. And then we're going to change the position to 0.5, 0, 0.5, 0. And I believe that should be done. So now all we have to do after the transition's finished, we're just going to destroy everything in each row aside from the UI grid layout. And the way we can do this is basically by using a for loop. So for O equals 1, rows do. So this is going to repeat 7 times. It's going to loop through each row. And how we're going to do that is basically use a in pairs loop. So in pairs row O, and we want to return a table to look through. So we use the get children function do. And basically we need to check if the item within that table is a frame, and if it's a frame, then we're going to destroy it. So I believe that should be done. Now let's go test it out. Wow. Okay. Wow. That was beautiful. So yeah, that was pretty much it. It's a lot of code, I know, but it's gonna be worth it because the transition is so cool. Like you saw it right there. And yeah, that concludes the tutorial. This is my first ever tutorial where I'm doing the programming and stuff. So if you have any feedback for me, please leave them in the comments. I pretty much appreciate it. And if you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer the comments. And yeah, so I guess that's it. Thank you and have a good day.